Our first speaker is Ari Kelman, who's the Jim Joseph Professor of Education and Jewish Studies in the Stanford Graduate School of Education. His research focuses on the forms and practices of religious knowledge transmission, and he's an expert in the social scientific study of American Jewry. He's the author of Jewish Education, 2024, in Rutgers Keywords in Jewish Studies series, and the author of Shout to the Lord, Making Worship Music in Evangelical America, 2018, and Station Identification, A Cultural History of Yiddish Radio, 2009. He's the co-editor of Beyond Jewish Identity, the editor of Is Dis a System, a Milt Gross comic reader, co-author of Sacred Strategies, Transforming Synagogues from Functional to Visionary, 2011. Recently, his research has focused on the racial and ethnic identities of American Jews, the politics of American Jewish demography, and the question of how people learn to be Jewish. In 2022, Professor Kelman led the task force on the Jewish experience at Stanford, which surfaced evidence of anti-Semitism in Stanford admissions during the 1950s. The title of his presentation today is Learning to Live in the Future.
The future is having a moment. From speculative fiction to sports betting to very rich people building bunkers in their backyards, people are into imagining what the future might look like. Mostly, though, it's not pretty. Generously, all this business about the future might be an attempt to imagine ourselves out of our current messes. After all, one of the key concepts in the study of the future is that you can't get there until you can envision it first. Project a goal and then backward plan. That's like the most likely way to reach that future. Less generously, it's a fad of mass delusion in which the future becomes the deferred site of all of our anxieties about the very problematic present. Global pandemics, environmental collapse, the exacerbation of wealth inequality, and of course, war and violence. If you spend any time at all in futurism studies, anybody? You will run into the work of a guy named Fred Pollack. Pollack was a Dutch Holocaust survivor who, in 1952, published a 2-volume, 700-page treatise called The Image of the Future. I can talk more about that book if you really want to. It's a foundational text in the field, if a very strange one, not least of all because the first volume, which clocks in at somewhere near 800 pages, is mostly a work of history. But the book's main idea, the visions of the future, from biblical time onward, thank you, is how visions of the future have shaped the present. You can understand the present, he argues, by looking at the visions of the future that were held by generations past. In one of the book's catchier aphorisms, he wrote, quote, "The rise and fall of images of the future precedes or accompanies the rise and fall of cultures. Without a vision of the future, societies and cultures are both lost. Everything," he argues, "starts with the future and then moves backwards into the present." You with me? So here we are 70 years after Pollack's treatise, and the future is no less present in the present than it was then. We've got the Jetsons and science fiction and Sun Ra and Afrofuturism and Rocket to the Moon and Chuck Berry's Johnny Be Good traveling through interstellar space strapped to the side of the Voyager 2 spacecraft on a golden record. We have dystopian fiction and films, which are a dime a dozen, and some utopian ones that are either really, really boring or just commonly dystopian ones in disguise. We can play a little game, too, about predicting the future. Are you ready? Are you ready to predict the future? Right on. You can even guess the next word that is going to come out of my... See how easy it is? It's terrific. That, of course, was a party trick, but it's not far off from our everyday world, or actually neuroscience, but that's a different conversation, which is awash in algorithms and computer models built for predicting the future. Right? Your next song, your next movie, your next streaming, whatever, is just a click away. And models of climate change and weather, from models of climate change and weather to simulations of international relations and conflict, to what movie or music I ought to consume based on my previous patterns of media consumption. By using massive amounts of data, algorithms guess what we want from our next trip to the store. They send us advertisements or incentives to go shop for what we do not yet know that we needed. And of course, generative AI seems like a visitor from the future, although not necessarily a welcome one. The future is here, and we are living in it. But unlike Pollack's model, the future has arrived without an image. At least that's how it feels. It feels increasingly like it's coming at us at accelerating speeds, whether we like it or not. Sometimes this is meant to make our lives easier. Update your phone, update your terms of service. Click on this if you want cookies. We're renovating to make it more accessible. But as media scholar study Wendy Chun has written, constant updates don't actually move us forward. They just help us stay in place. Updating is literally the least we can do to ensure that we can continue to function as we function as the future descends. I don't know how I ended up on like the hope and future panel, but that was an editorial decision. Our new media, Chun writes, have ceased to become portals to the future. Instead, they're just habitualized as we increasingly rely on these machines to function. Now, if there is any undertaking steeped in an investment in the future, it is my area of study, which is education. It's almost a cliche that education is training people for the future. But what future do educators have in mind? John Dewey thought American education would produce deliberative citizens of a robust democracy. After World War II, and really more so after Sputnik's revolution that the future was already here in 1957, American schooling pivoted towards STEM and the production of human capital to prepare people for a world of work and competition with the Russians. Since the 1970s, there's been a pivot toward education for equality and/or equity, and while the ideal remains strong, the larger project seems increasingly like a failure. We can throw in other examples too. There's Bell Hooks and Paulo Freire, Bettina Love, Sri Aurobindo, and the list goes on. Or other orientations, abolitionist education, Afrocentric education, Zionist education, Bildung, if you want to go back to the 19th and 18th centuries. All these approaches differ from one another on various points of focus or pedagogy, but they all advance a core belief of faith in education as a means for producing people who can live and thrive in the kind of future that their champions imagine. The relationship between education and the future is part of the reason that Fred Pollack wrote so much about utopias. Utopia is a huge part of his book. If utopias reflect visions of ideal future societies, education is almost always how we're supposed to get there. But per Pollack, it was always the images of the future that drove visions of education in the present. For most of modern history, Jewish education has largely followed this formula too, but with one important difference. Jewish education has been driven as much by a negative vision of the future as a positive one. Although Jewish educational thinkers may have outlined a positive view of their efforts on people or even communities, they have avoided almost entirely offering full-blown images of the future. They could imagine Jewish flourishing or Jewish communities populated by learned, caring, generous, ethical people who joined synagogues or engaged in lively debate and did not complain too much. But they rarely expanded that rosy vision beyond what they thought of as the Jewish community, or perhaps the Jewish people. There are two reasons for this. First, they understood that the terms of the future were not, by and large, going to be set by Jews. Jews would always be a small demographic minority, no matter where they lived, and they'd never wield power in any significant way. Jewishness was always to be lived, organized, and learned on someone else's terms. Second, because the Jews were a minority, their Jewishness could never be taken for granted. As a result, Jewishness had to be taught and it had to be learned. It was not inborn, or at least whatever Jewishness might have been inborn could not have been enough to resist either the pull of assimilation or to repel the forces of anti-Semitism. And of course, different communities had different ideas just about how education is supposed to go. Zionists had one set of ideas, the Bund had another set of ideas, the Alliance Israelite had another set, and so on and so on. The Yeshivot of Illusion and Tells had their ideas, the Wissenschaft had its ideas. And although the Jewish communities have been wildly creative in the variety of ways they tried to teach people to be Jewish, if they shared an image of the future, it was shaped by a basic understanding that they were always going to be subject to someone else's image of it. As a result, education, as the broadest and most common response to this awareness, has not been built in Jewish educational circles, and I think in Jewish history, at least in recent centuries, around a positive vision of the future. Instead, it was usually playing defense. Now, teaching people to be Jewish was supposed to solve the problem of Jews who could not or would not be Jewish and who didn't necessarily know how to live as Jews in an uncertain world. Education, therefore, didn't emerge out of some inherent quality of Jews' fidelity to text or intellectualism or some kind of natural affinity for asking hard questions or talking. It was born of a response to images of the future that appeared to be less than favorable to the survival of the Jews as a group. If the Jews became a people of the book, it was because for many centuries, books were the technological life rafts of the day. They were the most stable and durable expressions of shared or collective knowledge available. People wrote books, other people read them, other people published them and sold them or traded them, wrote in them as we saw before, and here we are. Books became the building blocks of a vision of Jewish education as a survival strategy. Although synagogues and prayer are often the thing that come to mind when people think of Jewish communal life, or federations or graduate programs and so on, I think, although we don't know for sure, that communities spent just about as much time and energy on teaching as they did on prayer. Certainly there was more faith in knowledge than there was in any divinity. And whether they spent that kind of energy on learning is a different question. Now, when I talk about learning, I don't want to limit things to just tech study or schools. But I think of it as an expansive term meant to embrace all of the ways in which people come to hold commitments or knowledge vital to living Jewish lives. It's cognitive and it's affective, it's embodied, and it's deeply and profoundly social. Jewishness may be conscious and sometimes unconsciousness, but it is always learned. Perhaps the stroke of genius in all of this focus on education is the seemingly obvious recognition that if Jews were to survive, and if Judaism or Jewish culture were to survive, people had to learn how to do it. They had to learn how to make it, how to act upon it, how to feel it, how to argue with it, how to reinvent it for a future that, as the future, was not going to be of their making. Now, Polak saw this otherwise. Among his many strange ideas, he acuted Jewish survival to the biblical covenant between the Israelites and God. Now I'm going to give you a long quote from Polak, so strap in. Quote, "The covenant then lays the foundation for the unique Jewish image of the future. In its own remarkable way, Israel developed an original system of self-determination, of fate, which was to determine the fate of the whole Western world for a long time to come, in the form of a pact with a self-assigned supernatural power. Everything in this image of the future speaks of otherness, the other God, the other man, the other destiny." That's the end of the quote. For Polak, the Jews were already in the future, which explains their survival over the centuries. But I think his claim is too crude. Even if we accept the Jewish connection with otherness and sort of uncanny ability to imagine a radically different future as the source of Jewish genius and survival, it still leaves one very practical question unanswered. Who held this idea? Which Jews was Polak talking about? And how did it propagate down the generations or across space and time? That is, if that idea actually existed, how did it come to be a shared understanding of things? We've all seen good ideas get watered down and good institutions go off the rails and good leaders who fail to pass the baton. And in Jewish cultural circles, there's a bunch of examples of this. There's the myth of Yeridat Hadorot, there's the opening passage of Pirkei Avot that laid out just how and to whom Moses passed his knowledge and where it finally ended up. Jewish cultures and communities have emphasized learning because that was their only resource for survival in a future that never looked particularly rosy. The strategy then was to configure a Jewishness that had to be produced and transmitted because it could not otherwise be taken for granted. In this way, learning became one of the organizing principles of Jewish communities, not because of an affinity for scholarship or intellectualism. And we might think of Hebrew schools or the Beis Midrash or text study as great examples of learning, but I, again, want to take a more capacious approach here and think about learning as something that's populated by specific acts, but is generally ecological in nature. It spans meals and gossip, bedtime rituals and arguments, art, music, culture, marginal scribbling, hanging out, haggling, protesting, and much more besides. Bodies come to know things come to know things, and we learn and think alongside the other people that we live with. At the risk of overstating the matter, you let me know if I do, every Jew everywhere learned to be Jewish somehow. Learning took its central place in Jewish life because learning was all that could be done in the face of a future that was less than hospitable and against which fighting would likely not pan out. Education, too, didn't always pan out. And efforts to instrumentalize it in the service of Jewish life are, I think, bound to fail. Instead, I want to frame Jewish learning as the medium of Jewish life. I think of it more than ritual, more than prayer, more than belief, more than tradition, because all of those things are learned too. After all, what else is a people who could never quite formulate their own image of the future supposed to do? They learned to live in other people's futures, and in the process, created their own. Thank you.